And the guy I'd sacrificed everything for hadn't even bothered to say goodbye. I was on my hands and knees installing a dishwasher in some guy's kitchen on a Saturday morning, about 2 months after I'd been fired, when Nadine called me. Her voice sounded strange, and she said, "There's a man at the door asking for you, and he says he's not leaving until he talks to you." I asked who it was, and she said, "I don't know. He's wearing a suit, and he drove up in a brand new truck." I drove home still covered in sweat, and when I pulled into the driveway, I didn't recognize the man standing on my porch. He was clean-shaven with short hair and a pressed shirt, and he was leaning against the railing like he had all the time in the world. And it wasn't until he smiled at me that I realized I was looking at Walt. He looked like a completely different human being. I just stood there in my driveway, unable to move, and Walt walked down the steps and handed me a thick envelope and said, "I told you I was going to pay you back." I opened it, and inside was a check for an amount that made my hands shake, and behind it was a lease agreement for a shop 2 towns over that was already fully set up and ready to go. I looked up at him and whispered, "What is this?" And Walt said, "My wife's life insurance was tied up in a legal fight for over 2 years, and it finally came through last month. And the very first thing I did was find you a shop, because you were the only person in this entire town who treated me like I was still a human being." I turned around, and Nadine was standing in the doorway with tears running down her face and her hand pressed over her mouth. And I looked back at Walt, and I couldn't say a single word, because everything I'd accepted as the truth for the last 2 months had just been completely and totally wrong. Walt put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I need one more favor though," and I managed to ask him what it was. And he smiled and said, "I want to go tell your old boss in person." We drove to Glenn's shop, and Walt parked his brand new truck right in the same spot where Glenn had told him to drive his piece of garbage somewhere else. Glenn was behind the counter when we walked in, and he looked at me and then at Walt and clearly had no idea who Walt was until Walt stepped forward and said, "You told me I smelled like a dumpster and to do everyone a favor and leave. Do you remember that?" Glenn's face went white and he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Walt leaned on the counter and said, "You fired the best mechanic you'll ever have because he helped someone you decided wasn't worth helping. And that tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are." Walt turned to me and said loud enough for every person in that building to hear, "Your shop opens in 3 weeks, and I already have your first month of customers lined up because it turns out people around here have been waiting for a mechanic who actually gives a damn about people." Glenn didn't say a word, and I didn't need him to, because the look on his face said everything. Walt became my first official customer when the shop opened, and he drove in with that same old truck that started everything. And when I asked him why he hadn't gotten rid of it, he said, "Because every time I look at it, I remember that somebody gave a damn when nobody else did." I heard through the grapevine over the next year that Glenn lost 3 mechanics because word got around town about how he'd treated me and Walt. And I won't pretend that didn't make me smile every single time I heard it.